My sister announced at Christmas dinner that I would be moving into care for our father full-time. When Petra's sister stood up at Christmas dinner and announced, in front of 11 family members, that Petra would be quitting her life to move in and care for their father full-time, Petra did something no one expected. She folded her napkin. She set it beside her plate. And then she started paying attention. What she found over the next 3 months changed everything she thought she understood about her family, her father's estate, and what her sister had been quietly doing for 4 years while everyone looked the other way. This is a story about family revenge, about how power hides in plain sight, and about what happens when the quietest person in the room finally decides to speak, through the right channels. If you love stories about boundaries, truth, and the cost of staying silent too long, hashtag family revenge, hashtag Reddit stories, hashtag family drama, hashtag revenge stories, hashtag estate betrayal story. Section 4, Full Story. My name is Petra Winslow. I am 34 years old. And I want to tell you about the Christmas dinner where my sister stood up in front of my entire family and announced my future, without consulting me, without warning me, and without a single person at that table turning to ask whether it was true. I want to tell you what I did when that happened. I want to tell you what I found afterward, in the months that followed, when I started paying the kind of attention I should have been paying for years. And I want to tell you what happened to my sister's careful, 4-year project when I finally brought what I had found to the right people. But first I need to tell you about my father. Because my sister spent a long time constructing a version of our family in which my father was the center, and she was his devoted protector, and I was the one who had drifted away and couldn't be relied on. She told this story so many times and to so many people that I think she eventually believed it herself. And the thing about a story told often enough is that it starts to feel like the truth, even to the people who know better. I knew better. But for a long time, I did not act on what I knew. That is the part one have had to sit with. My father is 71 years old. His name is Gerald. He was a civil engineer for 33 years, a precise, methodical man who spent his career calculating load-bearing tolerances and drainage slopes, who kept every receipt from every purchase for 14 years in labeled accordion folders, and who, when my mother died in March of 2019, transferred that precision entirely to the task of grief. He grieved methodically. He made lists. He held himself together with the structure of routine because that was the only tool he had ever trusted, and he applied it to loss the same way he applied it to everything else. My sister Daphne is 4 years older than me. She moved back to our hometown in April of 2019, 1 month after our mother died, and established herself as my father's primary support. At the time, I thought this was love. I live 3 hours away. I had been working for 7 years as a freelance technical writer, building a client base that was finally, in 2019, generating a sustainable income. I came home every 6 weeks. I called twice a week. Daphne was there every day. I told myself that was the right arrangement. That proximity was what my father needed, and Daphne could provide it. I sent money, $1,847 in March of 2019, $2,200 in June of 2019, $1,400 in September, deposited into a joint account my father and I had set up specifically for household expenses after my mother's death. Daphne had access to this account, as my father had asked. He wanted her to be able to handle things when he was having bad days, which in the first year were frequent. I did not look closely at the withdrawals from that account. I wish I had, but I am getting ahead of myself. What I want to tell you first is how it felt to be in that house in the months after my mother died. My father would sit at the kitchen table at 6:30 every morning, the exact time he had always started his day, because the routine was load-bearing, and he would drink his coffee and read the newspaper, and sometimes when I came home on weekends I would sit across from him, and we would not say much. Just sit. He was not a man who talked easily about what he felt, but he was a man who could communicate a great deal through the specific quality of his silences, and in that first year his silences were full of something I can only describe as careful endurance. He was managing. That was the most I could say. He was managing, and Daphne was there, and I was sending money, and I told myself this was what love looked like when it was distributed across distance. I also want to tell you what Daphne was like during this period, because it matters for understanding what came later. She was competent in a way that made you feel looked after. She cooked proper meals. She handled the utility bills, the medication refills, the scheduling of follow-up appointments. She sent me detailed updates, sometimes 2 paragraphs, sometimes half a page, describing what Dad had eaten that day, whether he had slept well, what the weather had been like on their afternoon walk. I read all of them. I was grateful for all of them. I did not question them because they were detailed and they were consistent, and there is a particular trust that detailed and consistent communication builds over time, a trust that I now understand can be constructed deliberately for exactly the purpose of disarming questions. In September of 2020, my father had a mild stroke. He recovered well, his speech was slightly affected for about 6 weeks, and his right hand had a tremor that persisted for 4 months before resolving almost completely. His doctor, a neurologist named Dr. Yusuf Adebanjo at the Regional Medical Center, told us in October that the prognosis was good, that my father's cognitive function was unaffected, and that with medication and reduced stress, he could expect a normal quality of life. I drove down the day my father came home from the hospital and stayed for 10 days. During those 10 days, Daphne ran the house. She cooked. She managed the medication schedule. She was warm and competent, and I was grateful for her. When I drove home on October 14th at 7:20 in the morning, I hugged my father for a long time in the driveway, and I told Daphne I did not know what we would do without her. I have thought about that sentence many times since then. What I did not know in October of 2020, what I would not know for another 2.5 years, was that 11 days after my father's stroke, Daphne had taken him to a solicitor's office. His name was Martin Greer, and he practiced out of a small office on the main street of our hometown, and on October 9th at 2:30 in the afternoon, while my father was still on a modified schedule and had been taking a sedating blood pressure medication that his neurologist would later revise, Daphne had my father sign a durable power of attorney document naming her his sole agent for financial and medical decisions. I was not told about this. My father did not mention it to me. When I asked him once, in passing, whether he had thought about updating his estate documents, he said that Daphne was handling things. I accepted that. The joint account I had been contributing to, the one for household expenses, I checked it in February of 2021. The balance was $214.33. I had deposited $7,263 into it over the previous 22 months. I called Daphne and asked about the balance. She told me it had been a difficult year, that Dad's medical expenses had been significant, that she had been managing everything, and it was hard. Her voice had that particular edge of the terminally exhausted, flat and slightly performative. I said I understood, and I sent another $2,000 that afternoon. That same month, February of 2021, Daphne said something to me that I wrote down in a notebook the evening after she said it, because it unsettled me in a way I could not name. We had been on the phone for 45 minutes, going over Dad's schedule, and I had asked whether he might want to see a financial planner to make sure his retirement accounts were properly structured for the next phase. Daphne said, "I'm already handling everything with his money. You don't need to worry about that part." The sentence was reasonable on its face. The tone was not. The tone was the tone of someone closing a door. I wrote it down. I did not do anything with it for 2 more years. That is my failure, and I own it. By the spring of 2022, I had sent a total of $19,340 in contributions to the household account since my mother's death. I did not know this precise number at the time. I assembled it later from my bank records, but I knew the contributions were significant and consistent, and I checked the balance less and less frequently because checking had become its own quiet source of anxiety. In May of 2022, I noticed the balance was $387.14. I called Daphne. She said the boiler had needed replacing in March and that it had cost more than expected. She said she had covered the difference herself and hoped I appreciated that she was not keeping score. I said I appreciated it very much. Then I sent $1,500 and did not check the account again for 4 months. I want to be honest about something. At no point during this period did I disbelieve Daphne completely. I doubted sometimes. I noticed things that did not quite add up. But I told myself that managing a parent's illness from a distance gives you an incomplete picture, and that Daphne's irritability when I asked questions was the irritability of someone who is exhausted and undersupported. I told myself these things because I wanted them to be true, and because I was, in my own way, afraid of what it would mean if they were not. Before I tell you what Daphne announced at Christmas dinner, and what I did after, I want to ask you something. Whatever the weather is where you are right now, whatever time of day it is, whatever you can see from your window, have you ever been the person in the family who told themselves everything was probably fine? The one who chose the simpler explanation because the complicated one was too costly to consider? I want you to know I was that person for 4 years. And I want you to know what it cost me, and what it cost my father before I stopped being her. Christmas of 2023. My father's house. 11 people around the table. My father at the head, Daphne and her husband Craig to his left, my Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Ned across, 3 of Daphne's husband's relatives filling the middle seats, my father's neighbor Hank, who had been included every year since his wife died, and me, at the far end, next to an empty chair where my mother used to sit. Daphne had cooked. She always cooked now at my father's house. She had assumed that role so completely that the kitchen felt like hers when I came to visit, and I had started feeling like a guest in the house where I grew up. I noticed this but had learned not to say it. I had learned a great many things not to say. In the summer of 2022, when I mentioned during a visit that I had noticed the front gutters needed replacing and offered to arrange a quote, Daphne told me that she was already handling the house maintenance and that it was easy to have opinions when you weren't the one doing the work. My father was in the other room. He did not say anything. We were finishing the main course. It was 6:47 in the evening. My father had had 2 glasses of wine, which was more than usual, and he looked relaxed in a way that I had not seen for some time. Daphne had been cheerful all afternoon, a specific kind of cheerful, animated in a way that was slightly too consistent, that I recognized later as the cheerfulness of someone who has already made a plan and is simply waiting to execute it. Then Daphne put down her fork, stood up, and said she had an announcement. She said it had been a long year and that Dad's needs had increased, which was partially true. He had had a second, smaller cardiac event in October of 2023, nothing severe, but requiring a medication adjustment and more careful monitoring. She said that as a family they had been discussing what the next stage would look like. She said it was clear that Dad needed more consistent support than she alone could provide. And then she said it, looking not at me but at the table in general, in the tone of someone presenting a foregone conclusion. Petra doesn't have a real career anyway. She has time. She's going to move in and help care for Dad full-time starting in February. My Aunt Sylvia nodded. My Uncle Ned cut his turkey.
No one looked at me. My father looked at his wine glass.
Craig said, "That's really great," in the tone of a man who had been told what to say and had said it. Hank nodded at his plate. I picked up my napkin. I folded it in half, then in half again. I set it beside my plate. I said, "Excuse me," in a voice that I kept very even. And I walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall and stood over the sink and looked at my face in the mirror for approximately 90 seconds. Then I went back to the table. I finished my dinner. I helped with the dishes. At 8:42 p.m. Daphne asked if I had any thoughts about the February timeline, whether I would need time to wind down my current contracts. I said I would have to look at my schedule. She nodded. Craig refilled his own glass. My father had fallen asleep in the armchair by 9 o'clock, the way he sometimes did after dinner, and I went and sat beside him for a few minutes before I said my goodbyes. I hugged him at 9:15 p.m. He squeezed my hand. I drove home. I did not say a word to Daphne about the announcement that evening. Not one word. I want to tell you about the drive home, because that is where the real story begins. I had 3 hours. I drove the first hour on instinct, processing the immediate waves of the thing, the humiliation of it, the casualness with which she had done it, the specific cruelty of the phrase "doesn't have a real career anyway," which she had said not to hurt me privately, but to establish a narrative publicly, in front of witnesses, so that when I objected I would look like the difficult one. That is what the phrase was for. Not to describe me accurately. To position me before the conversation about positioning began. By the second hour, something had shifted. Something inside me had gone very cold, And in that coldness, I was thinking clearly for the first time in a long time about the entire preceding 4 years. The joint account balance in February of 2021. The door-closing tone of the phone call that same month. The power of attorney I had never been shown, that my father had mentioned obliquely, and that I had filed away and not returned to. The $2,000 I had sent that February that had disappeared into a balance of $214. The email updates detailed and consistent that had built a particular kind of trust. The gutters. The way Daphne never quite answered a financial question directly. She answered the emotional register of the question and let the financial part slide past. By the third hour, I had made a decision. I stated it aloud in the car because it helped me to hear it in my own voice. I said, I am going to find out exactly what has been happening, and then I am going to handle it correctly. That was all. I did not plan a confrontation. I did not compose a message to Daphne. I drove home, made tea at 11:47 p.m., and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down every financial contribution I could remember making with dates, and every time I had been given incomplete or evasive information about where the money had gone, and every sentence that had felt wrong when I heard it and that I had filed away and not returned to. I filled 4 pages. The pages were dense with specific amounts and specific dates and specific words, and looking at them laid out in sequence I could see, for the first time, the shape of the thing. Not carelessness. A pattern. The first call I made was on December 27th at 9:03 in the morning to my father's accountant, a man named Douglas Parr who had handled my parents' tax returns for 17 years. I told him I was trying to get a clearer picture of my father's financial situation and asked if we could meet. He said he would need my father's written authorization to share information with me. I said I understood and would arrange it. I drove down to see my father on December 28th. We sat at the kitchen table at his 6:30 a.m. coffee time. Daphne was not there. She arrived most days around 9, and I told him, carefully, that I had some questions about his financial arrangements and whether he felt they were working the way he wanted. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. I signed some things I didn't fully read. I asked him when. He said around the time of his stroke. He said Daphne had told him it was routine, that it would make things easier, that it was the kind of thing everyone in his situation did. He said his hand had been shaking and he had not been able to see the documents very clearly, and that Daphne had said not to worry, that she would explain everything later. She had not explained anything later. I asked him if he would be willing to let me look into things on his behalf. He looked at me for a long time across the kitchen table, the same table where he had started every morning for 30 years, the same table where my mother had died reading a recipe on a Saturday, the same table where I had done homework and had arguments and had been 16 years old, and then 23, and now 34, and he said, yes, I think that would be a good idea. He signed the authorization for Douglas Parr that morning at 7:41 a.m. I drove to Douglas Parr's office on December 29th at 10 a.m. What Douglas Parr showed me over the next hour and 40 minutes was not what I had expected. I had expected careless management, sloppy accounting, disorganized receipts, the ordinary entropy of a busy person handling someone else's money without quite enough attention.
What I found instead was a pattern.
Between October of 2020 and November of 2023, 37 months, the joint household account had received $43,617 in combined deposits from me and from my father's pension. The account balance at the time of my December visit was $214.33. The gap, $43,402.67, had been moved, in increments ranging from $800 to $3,400 at intervals of roughly 3 to 6 weeks, to an account in Daphne's name alone. Douglas Parr had not been aware of this account existed. He had flagged the withdrawals as unusual when reviewing my father's tax documents in the spring of 2023 and had sent Daphne a written query in April of that year. She had replied by email that the transfers were for home renovation costs. He had sent a follow-up asking for receipts. She had replied that she would gather them. He had not followed up again. He showed me the full email thread. There were no invoices attached to any of her replies, and the follow-up she had promised had never been sent. I sat in Douglas Parr's office and looked at the transfer history for a long time. I looked at the dates. I looked at the amounts. I looked at the gap between what came in and what remained. Then I took out my phone and photographed every page. On January 4th at 8:30 a.m., I called an attorney. Her name was Frances Okeke, and she specialized in elder law and estate litigation out of a practice 45 minutes from my apartment. She had been recommended by a colleague of mine who had navigated a guardianship dispute with his own family 3 years earlier, and he told me that she was the most methodical person he had ever worked with, that she did not make promises she could not keep, and that she kept detailed notes of everything. Those were the qualities I needed. I met with Frances Okeke on January 7th at 2 p.m. I brought everything: the transfer history, Douglas Parr's notes, the photographs, my own 4 handwritten pages, and the notebook entry from February of 2021 where I had written down Daphne's door-closing sentence verbatim. Frances reviewed all of it while I sat across from her. She did not say anything for 11 minutes. Then she set the papers down, picked up her pen, and said, "The power of attorney is the first thing we need to look at." She obtained a copy of the document through proper channels by January 14th. She called me that evening at 6:18 p.m. She said she needed me to think carefully before she read me what she had found. She said the document had been signed on October 9th, 2020, 11 days after my father's stroke, while he was on a medication, she named it, that had known cognitive side effects at the dose he had been prescribed during the immediate post-stroke recovery period. She said that the neurologist's notes from October 2020, which she had obtained with my father's written authorization, documented that my father had been experiencing, in Dr. Adebanjo's language, difficulty with sustained attention and complex sequential tasks at that time. She said that this created a significant and documentable question about whether my father had had the legal capacity to execute the power of attorney on that date. She said one more thing, and she said it carefully. The document named Daphne as sole agent with no co-agent, no oversight mechanism, no accounting requirement, and no notification requirement to any other family member. She said in her 22 years of practice, she had never seen a durable power of attorney for an elderly parent drafted without at minimum a notification provision, unless the drafting attorney had specifically been instructed to omit one. She filed a petition to revoke the power of attorney on a Wednesday in March, the 6th, at 11:47 a.m. She simultaneously filed a request for an independent accounting of my father's finances to be conducted by a court-appointed fiduciary. She also filed a bar complaint against Martin Greer, the original drafting attorney, citing professional responsibility concerns in the execution of a document for a client whose capacity was questionable at the time of signing. I did not call Daphne when the filing happened. I did not send a message. I had made the decision 3 months earlier, sitting in my car at midnight with a cold cup of tea and 4 pages of handwriting on my kitchen table, that I was going to handle this correctly. Correctly meant through channels. Correctly meant documentation and process and patience. Not a phone call at 11 p.m., not a confrontation at Christmas, not an accusation without evidence. The kind of handling that holds up. The kind that my father deserved. Daphne found out when she was served notice of the petition on March 8th at 9:22 a.m. She called me 47 minutes later, at 10:09 a.m. I did not answer. She called again at 10:34, and at 11:07, and at 11:52, and at 12:30. 5 calls before noon. I have the log on my phone still. At 2:47 p.m., she sent a text message. It said, "This is insane. I gave up 4 years of my life for Dad. You have no idea what I sacrificed." I read it once. I set my phone face down on my desk. I did not reply. At 6:03 p.m. my Uncle Ned called. The same uncle who had been at Christmas dinner cutting his turkey while my future was being announced for me, and said he was sure there had been a misunderstanding, and could we all just sit down together. I told him there was no misunderstanding. I thanked him for calling. I said I hoped he had a good evening. He said Daphne was very upset. I said I was sure she was, and I meant it without irony because I imagined she was. The independent fiduciary, a man named Stuart Hamill, appointed by the court, who had been conducting estate audits for 29 years, completed his review on November 14th. His report documented $43,402.67 in transfers from the household account to Daphne's personal account over 37 months, for which no supporting invoices, receipts, or documentation of services rendered could be produced. He further documented that the power of attorney had been used, in January of 2022, to remove my father as a beneficiary on 2 life insurance policies and to replace him with Daphne as sole beneficiary. The combined value of those policies was $287,400. Frances Okeke filed the full civil complaint on November 19th. The estate lawyer she had brought in to review the power of attorney document, a specialist named David Brannigan who had clerked for a probate judge for 6 years before entering private practice, confirmed formally in a written opinion dated November 22nd that the power of attorney was unenforceable based on the documented questions about my father's capacity at signing, and that the financial transactions conducted under its authority were legally voidable. Daphne was formally removed as executor of my father's estate on December 28th, 3 days before the new year. She called me at 8:14 a.m. on December 29th. I did not answer. She called 11 more times before 5 p.m. The log is still on my phone. I answered none of them. The last voicemail she left, at 4:41 p.m., she was crying. She said she had done everything for this family. She said she had been there every single day. She said I was the one who had left, who had always left, and that she was the one who had stayed and done the work, and now I was taking everything away from her. She said that I, of all people, should understand what it meant to sacrifice. I listened to the voicemail once that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. Outside the window, the street was gray and quiet. I thought about the phrase Petra doesn't have a real career anyway, and the way 11 people had received it at a Christmas table without anyone turning to look at me, and I thought about my father signing a document with a shaking hand while someone told him it was routine. Then I deleted the voicemail. My father is still in his house. He has a care coordinator now, a woman named Judith Osei, who visits 3 times a week, manages his medication schedule, accompanies him to appointments, and checks in by phone on the other 4 days. He likes her. He told me she reminds him of a junior colleague he had at the engineering firm in the 1990s, precise, no-nonsense, reliable. He said this as the highest possible compliment, and I understood it as such. I drive down every 3 weeks. We sit at the kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning with our coffee, and we don't always say much, and the silences are different now. They are not the careful endurance of a man holding himself together. They are something quieter and more settled. He told me once, in October, that he sleeps better than he has in years. He said he didn't realize how much he had been worrying. I asked him what he had been worrying about. He said, about whether anyone was watching out for him. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about the particular terror of aging, of having the precision and capability that defined you begin to soften at the edges, and not knowing whether the people closest to you are tending you or using you. About how much courage it takes to say, sitting at a kitchen table at 6 in the morning, I signed some things I didn't fully read. About how much trust that sentence required. Love is not proximity. Love is not the loudest presence in the room, or the one who controls the kitchen, or the one who arranges the Christmas dinner and announces the future as though it has already been decided. Love is the person who sits across the table and asks, "Are things working the way you want them to?" And who listens to the answer, whatever it is, without deciding in advance what it means. I make coffee now in my own apartment. I take calls from my father on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. On my kitchen windowsill there is a small piece of carved wood he gave me last Christmas, a tiny engineer's transit level, something he had kept on his desk for 30 years. He pressed it into my hand when I was leaving and said he wanted me to have it.
I did not ask why.
I think I understand it now. Some truths wait. They sit in accordion folders and transfer records and signed invoices, in the gap between what is said at a dinner table and what is actually true. The patient thing, the difficult, important thing, is not to miss them when they finally surface. Before I go, one thing for you. People who study financial elder abuse, the formal legal and clinical term for what my sister did to my father, note that it is among the most underreported and underdetected forms of financial exploitation, precisely because it occurs most often within families, and because the people best positioned to notice it are also the people most motivated to accept an innocent explanation. The most consistently effective protective tool, across multiple studies and legal frameworks, is documentation. Financial records, communication logs, written authorizations, professional second opinions obtained independently. Not accusations. Not confrontations. Documentation. The kind that holds up when a court-appointed fiduciary is handed 37 months of transfer records and asked to produce receipts. I wish I had started earlier. I wish I had looked at that account balance in February of 2021 and done what I eventually did instead of sending another $2,000 and accepting the explanation I was given. But I also understand that I could not have been the person who did that earlier than I did. I had to become that person. The becoming took time and cost things, and is its own kind of grief that I am still in the middle of. If you were in Petra's position, sitting in your car at midnight with 4 pages of handwriting and the shape of the thing finally visible, would you have gone directly to an attorney, the way she did? Or would you have confronted your sister first, that same Christmas night, in front of the 11 people who had watched it all begin? I know which one I chose. I know what it gave me. And I know what my father said to me at 7:41 in the morning on December 28th, over coffee at the kitchen table where he had always started his day, when I asked him if he would let me look into things on his behalf. He said, "I was waiting for someone to ask."